The call came in at 03:14 a.m. Detective Sergeant Elias Thorne hated the deep hours. They were reserved for cheap diners, bad decisions, and crimes that clawed their way out of the city's concrete underbelly. Tonight's call was different. It wasn't a domestic dispute, a liquor store stick-up, or a fatal hit-and-run. It was a 10-97, officer needs assistance. Thorne was the lead investigator for the Major Crimes Unit in East Division, a man whose graying temples were earned by staring into the human abyss one arrest at a time. The dispatcher's voice, usually a monotone drone, was a high, thin wire of panic. All units, proceed to 4101 Ash Street, abandoned Peterson Mill. Officer down. Repeat, officer down. Unit 314 is unresponsive. Last audio was a scream. The Peterson Mill was a notorious local landmark, a skeletal ruin of brick and steel that had haunted the docks for 50 years. Kids dared each other to sneak in, the homeless avoided it. It was a place where things went to die, or be forgotten. Thorne flipped on the sirens of his unmarked cruiser, the whoop-whoop slicing through the pre-dawn silence. His partner, Detective Lena Cruz, a whip-smart former tactical analyst, gripped the door handle, her knuckles white. Unit 314, Cruz murmured, consulting her radio log. That's Officer Samuel Reyes. Alone. Perimeter check on a suspected squatter's camp. What the hell was he doing inside the mill? Following procedure, probably, Thorne growled, swerving around a taxi. And if he screamed, it wasn't a mugger with a pipe. Reyes is 6'4" and built like a fire hydrant. They arrived minutes later. The scene was bathed in the sickly amber glow of the single surviving sodium lamp near the mill gate, casting long, dancing shadows. Reyes's patrol car, Unit 314, was parked haphazardly near the fence line, its door wide open, the interior dome light illuminating an empty seat. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp concrete, rust, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like fresh blood mixed with ozone. Stay behind me, Lena, Thorne said, drawing his Sig Sauer and flipping the safety off. He clicked on his tactical flashlight. They crossed the ruined parking lot. The only sound was the wind whistling through the mill's broken windows. They found the first sign in the mill's receiving bay, a huge, empty space where massive turbines once stood. It was a massive drag mark across the dust and grime on the floor, leading toward the main staircase, but it wasn't the drag mark that made Thorne freeze. It was the bullet casing. A spent 9mm round, Officer Reyes's standard issue. It suggested a brief, frantic struggle, an attempt at self-defense that was immediately silenced. Then, they found the radio. IT was Reyes's handheld unit, smashed against the support column. The casing was cracked, the speaker grill warped. Thorne bent down, shining his light, and saw it, a small, almost surgical incision carved into the plastic housing, leaving a tiny, neat spiral pattern. He didn't drop this, Lena, Thorne whispered, standing up. It was placed here. Deliberately. They followed the drag mark up the iron staircase, the rusted steps groaning under their weight. It led them to the third floor, a vast, echoing space full of defunct machinery. The metallic, bloody scent here was overpowering. They reached a darkened alcove, a forgotten office corner where the floorboards were rotten and gave way to the basement below. Thorne raised his gun, his breath catching in his throat. Officer Samuel Reyes was there. He wasn't dead. He was pinned, his back pressed against the wall, his heavy-duty uniform jacket ripped open. But what pinned him wasn't an assailant or a piece of machinery. His uniform shirt, his vest, and the skin beneath were completely intact. But two parallel lines of thick, dried blood ran horizontally across his chest, stopping exactly at the edges of his vest, and then they saw the object that was keeping him upright. It was a piece of white chalk, a cheap, ordinary piece of blackboard chalk, driven 3 inches deep into the sternum bone, precisely through the tiny gap between the chest plates of his protective vest. It looked like a child's sick, minimalist art project, but Reyes's face wasn't the worst part. His eyes were wide open, staring past them at the dark ceiling, but his jaw was slack. His tongue had been removed, and in its place, crammed deep into the cavity of his mouth, was a single, perfectly folded piece of white paper. Thorne, a man who had seen bodies dissolved in acid, felt a sudden, cold wave of nausea. This wasn't professional. This was ceremonial. Cruz was already moving, checking Reyes's pulse. "He's alive, Elias." "Faint, but alive." "Call EMTs." Thorne holstered his weapon, his hands shaking, and gently, with the tip of his knife, he extracted the paper from Reyes's mouth. The paper was dry, smelling faintly of old books and dust. He unfolded it. It was not a note. It was a meticulous, detailed, hand-drawn map of the Peterson mill, laid out perfectly to scale, complete with blueprints and ventilation shafts. And in one corner, near the bottom right, a single, tiny, handwritten word, "heard." Before Thorne could radio in the bizarre discovery, the air above them fractured. A noise, not a bang, not a whisper, but a high-pitched, resonant thrumming sound, shook the floorboards. Then, a cold, heavy object landed with a wet thud directly at Thorne's feet. He looked down. It was a police badge, not Reyes's, but another, older one, crusted with what looked like dried mud and something shiny and black. It was the badge of a patrolman named Officer David Mac McDougal, who had vanished without a trace from this very mill 12 years ago, the only unsolved missing person case in Thorne's entire career. Attached to the back of the badge with a piece of heavy-gauge fishing wire was a second, small scroll of paper. Thorne unrolled it, his breath catching again. This note wasn't a map. It was a single, elegant line, written in the same precise handwriting. "The one who hears the silence must also hear the sacrifice." The arrival of the EMTs shattered the silence, their hurried movements and loud radio static a jarring intrusion into the mill's sacred, rusty quiet. Thorne watched them carefully stabilize Officer Reyes, the piece of chalk still impossibly lodged in his sternum, a grotesque anchor. "Get that chalk." "Get the paper," Thorne barked at a uniformed officer, his voice raw. "Forensics team priority on both." "And this badge." McDougal's badge. "Treat it like a ticking bomb." As Reyes was stretchered out, his eyes still wide and vacant, Thorne found Cruz staring at the spot where the badge had landed. 12 years, Cruz whispered, running a gloved hand along the cold concrete. McDougal vanished on April 17, 2013. His patrol car was found 2 blocks from here, abandoned, keys in the ignition. No struggle, no witness, just gone. "You worked that case, Elias." Thorne nodded, a bitter taste in his mouth. "I led the search. We spent a week tearing this ruin apart. We found nothing. Not a shred of his uniform, not a single drop of blood." He looked at the note in his hand, the elegant, unnerving script. "The one who hears the silence must also hear the sacrifice." "The note is telling us 2 things, Elias," Cruz said, her analytical mind already grinding through the terror. 1. Whoever did this is McDougal. 2. This sacrifice, Reyes being pinned, mutilated, but kept alive, is tied to McDougal's silence. Back at the precinct, the major crimes bullpen was a low hum of controlled chaos. Thorne and Cruz were hunched over the 2 pieces of evidence found in the mill. The first was Reyes's map, a flawless blueprint of the mill's interior, marked with a single, crucial red X deep within the sub-basement steam tunnels, a place they had never fully cleared during the original search. The word "heard" was scrawled next to it. The second was the note attached to McDougal's badge. Lab results came back fast. The paper was old, manufactured before 2010. The ink was a unique blend of India ink and animal charcoal, something an artist or an old-world craftsman might use. And the fingerprint found on the fishing wire? A partial match to McDougal himself. McDougal touched this wire, Cruz stated, tapping the forensic report. 12 years later, this wire connects to his badge, which is delivered to us. It's a game, Elias. And the game master wants us to go to the X. Thorn leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Reyes wasn't sacrificed, Lena. He was marked. And he was forced to hold the map of where we need to go. What did he hear that made him a witness? The silence, Cruz said, pointing to the word on the map. Maybe the mill isn't silent anymore. Maybe that's what the thrumming sound you heard was, the noise that accompanied the delivery of the badge. A sound we were meant to follow. Let's follow it, Thorn decided, grabbing his jacket. We're going to the sub-basement. No uniforms. No backup yet. We use Reyes's map, and we see what McDougal left for us. They returned to the Peterson Mill under a weak, overcast sunrise. They navigated the maze of the main floor, the map proving eerily accurate, guiding them past collapsed corridors and down into the pitch-black maw of the sub-basement. The air here was colder, denser, and carried a faint, unsettling echo of the metallic smell from the night before. They followed the map's route through a series of cramped, claustrophobic steam tunnels, the red X marking their final destination, a section of the wall sealed decades ago with poured concrete. This entire tunnel system was supposed to be flooded 30 years ago, Thorn muttered, examining the rough concrete patch. The blueprints show nothing behind this wall. They sealed it up because of a structural weakness. Cruz knelt down, running her flashlight beam over the concrete. Look closer, Elias. The ceiling is old, but someone has worked on this recently. She pointed to tiny, fresh score marks near the bottom edge. They didn't break in. They poured the seal, waited for it to dry, and then they chiseled something. Out. Thorn placed his hand on the concrete. It felt unnaturally cold, radiating a deep chill that seeped into his bones. He pushed against it, and to his astonishment, a 2-foot-wide section of the wall swung inward with a dry, grinding sound, revealing a narrow, dust-choked cavity beyond. It was a perfect, square hole, just large enough for a man to crawl through. Heard, Thorn said, recognizing the sickening implication. He was made to hear something, and then he was used to send us here. McDougal was used in the same way, 12 years ago. Cruz shone her light into the darkness. It smells like earth and ozone. And wood paint. Old oil paint. They drew their weapons and Thorn slipped through first, landing on a floor that was uneven, not concrete, but packed, dry soil. He raised his light, his heart pounding a heavy, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He was in a small, windowless chamber, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, hidden completely outside the mill's original structural design. It was a secret room, a hidden studio. The room was empty except for a small wooden table, a single chair, and a canvas easel standing against the far wall. The air was dry and cold. On the easel was a freshly completed painting. It was a meticulous, photorealistic oil painting of Officer Samuel Reyes. Not Reyes as he looked now, but Reyes as he had been found, chalk in the chest, blood on the uniform, the terrible empty space where his tongue had been. It was so fresh, the oil paint was still tacky to the touch, and lying on the table, next to the palette and brushes, was a third, smaller piece of paper. Thorn picked it up. It was another single line of elegant handwriting, the same charcoal and ink blend, and a new, terrible hook for their attention. The one who sees the map must follow the path, for the path leads to the next piece. He sleeps where the water sings, in the silence that the city ignores. Thorn stared at the painting of Reyes, the raw terror in the depicted eyes mocking the detective's failure to prevent the attack. The level of detail was sickening, a level of observation only possible by someone who had been inches away from the victim. This is impossible, Cruz breathed, examining the freshly applied paint. He attacked Reyes less than 5 hours ago, delivered the badge, and then painted this masterpiece down here, inside a sealed room, and disappeared before we found the map? He's a ghost. Thorn focused on the third note. He sleeps where the water sings, in the silence that the city ignores. Water sings, Thorn muttered, turning his flashlight slowly around the small, secret room. We're next to the docks. Rivers, canals, the harbor. Cruz pointed to a small, nearly invisible marking etched into the wood of the table. Look, Elias. Another carving, faint, but here. It was a small, crudely drawn symbol, a vertical line with a half circle on top, resembling a stylized, broken tuning fork. Beneath it, the year 2007. It's a date, Thorne said. And some kind of signature. Another piece of the puzzle, but what does the water sings mean? They called in the find, securing the secret room as a crime scene. As they drove back to the station, Thorne contacted Captain Reynolds, a man whose patience was as thin as his hair. Captain, Thorne stated plainly, ignoring the expected reprimand for withholding information about McDougal's badge, we have an active serial offender. He's an artist. He's methodical. And he's targeting people connected to the East Division, past and present. Thorne ordered a deep dive into all missing persons and cold cases from 2007 and 2013 that had any connection to water, music, or the East Division. By mid-afternoon, Cruz had cross-referenced the unique elements, water singing, and the year 2007. I have a hit, Elias, Cruz announced, throwing a thick case file onto Thorne's desk. The only major cold case in 2007 with a water connection in our jurisdiction, the disappearance of Danny Wexler. Wexler had been a 19-year-old music student at the City Conservatory. He was known for composing ambient, minimalist electronic music, often called drone or acoustic ecology, pieces designed to incorporate the sounds of the environment. His last known project was a piece titled The City's Quiet Chorus, recorded entirely at the abandoned Peterson Mill. He went missing from his apartment, no signs of struggle, Cruz explained. The police theory was a runaway or an overdose. His parents insisted he wouldn't leave his music. Thorne opened the file to a photo of Wexler, a pale, intense young man with heavy-rimmed glasses, clutching a worn leather satchel. His music, Thorne said, pointing to the key detail. The city's quiet chorus. He used the mill's sounds. He was recording the silence. And what sings? Cruz continued, connecting the dots. Danny Wexler's last composition was reportedly a piece using hydrophones, underwater microphones, to record the resonant frequencies of the main city reservoir and its underground intake pipes. He called it the water song. Thorne stood up. The reservoir. That's the silence the city ignores. It's a closed-off area, miles of underground pipes, perfect for a hidden structure. Before they could mobilize, an urgent phone call came in from the hospital. Officer Reyes had stabilized, but he had finally been roused, lucid enough to communicate by blinking. Thorne drove fast, arriving to find a surgical team had delicately removed the chalk from Reyes' sternum. The doctor confirmed the loss of the tongue was almost surgical, a clean, precise excision, not a tear or bite. Thorne leaned close to Reyes, who was heavily sedated, his eyes burning with fear. Sam, Thorne whispered. It's Elias Thorne. Tell me what happened. Did you see him? Reyes' eyes were locked on Thorne's. He shook his head weakly, blinking rapidly. No. Did you hear him? Reyes' eyes fluttered, then blinked once. Yes. What did you hear, Sam? Tell me what you heard. Reyes, summoning a monumental effort, forced his right hand to move. He raised his index finger and slowly, agonizingly, began to trace a pattern on the crisp white hospital sheet. He drew the symbol, the vertical line with the half circle. The broken tuning fork. Then, he traced three quick, shaky letters, D. W. Danny Wexler. He heard Wexler, Lena. Thorne radioed Cruz as he sprinted out of the hospital. The killer made Reyes listen to Wexler. And the symbol is the killer's signature, or maybe a marker for his victims. Thorne and Cruz, armed with the new information, raced toward the city's old central reservoir, a vast, gated complex fed by a network of immense, deep tunnels. They found the facility deserted. The main pump house was a massive, echoing concrete bunker. Inside, the massive pipes hummed with the constant, deep-throated thrumming that Thorne had heard briefly at the mill. This was the singing. They followed the sound down a slippery steel staircase into the main pump chamber, where water rushed and echoed within pipes the size of small cars. Near the central intake valve, Thorne's flashlight beam illuminated the disturbing sight. Sitting upright, submerged to the waist in the cold, churning water of the access pool, was the leather satchel from Danny Wexler's missing person photo. It was waterlogged and ancient. Thorne waded in and carefully pulled it out. It was heavy, packed with something dense. He laid it on the platform and unbuckled the clasp. Inside, nestled among water-damaged papers, was a meticulously recorded, 12-year-old DAT tape, labeled simply, "The Water Song Master." Beneath the tape, however, was another object, placed there deliberately by the killer. It was a small, beautifully carved wooden box, no bigger than a cigarette pack, polished smooth and smelling of resin. Engraved on the lid was the broken tuning fork symbol, and the date 2007. Thorne opened the lid. The box was lined with velvet. Inside, there were 3 items: a fresh and used stick of white chalk, a single, tiny piece of human finger bone, a 4th note. Thorne pulled out the note, his hands shaking with barely controlled fury. The handwriting was the same perfect, elegant script. The one who retrieves the sound must choose who plays the next song. Your silence will be the sacrifice. Listen to what Daniel heard, detective. The next lesson begins when the music ends. Thorne gripped the tiny wooden box, the weight of the finger bone feeling disproportionately heavy. The immediate implication was horrifying. The bone belonged to Daniel Wexler, a grim trophy from a murder 12 years in the past. But why deliver it now, with a fresh stick of chalk and a direct command to listen? He wants us to hear the tape, Thorne said, his voice flat. He's making us complicit in his twisted narrative. This isn't just a serial killer, it's a performance artist forcing us into the audience. Cruz pointed to the DAT tape. If this is the water song, then it's the last thing Wexler ever recorded. And Reyes heard it. He was exposed to this sound before the chalk attack. They raced back to the precinct, securing the box and the tape as high-priority evidence. The precinct's audiovisual lab managed to extract the data from the waterlogged DAT tape. It was transferred to a secure playback system. Thorne, Cruz, and the lead audio technician, a nervous young man named Miller, gathered in the soundproof lab. "It's about 45 minutes long," Miller whispered, adjusting the volume dials. "Looks like pure field recording. Hydrophones. Ambient sound." Thorne nodded. "Play it." The lab was immediately filled with the sound of rushing water, deep, booming hydrophone recordings from the massive reservoir pipes they had just left. It was a resonant, heavy sound, like the city's heart beating deep underground. For the first 30 minutes, it was only that, the powerful, endless drone of water and concrete. Cruz sighed, shifting in her seat. "Nothing, Elias. Just water." "Wait," Thorne said, leaning forward. "Listen to the frequency." The drone wasn't steady. It had a rhythmic pulse, a deep thrum-thrum-thrum, the same resonant vibration Thorne had felt at the mill. Wexler had captured the acoustic signature of the entire pipe network. Then, at the 37-minute mark, the water sounds began to fade slightly, replaced by a new, distinct acoustic layer. It was muffled, distant, and metallic. Clang, scrape. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy equipment being moved inside a vast, empty space. "That's the Peterson Mill," Thorne recognized instantly. That echo, the open space. Wexler kept recording after he left the reservoir pipes. The recording intensified. The sound was now clearly a metallic object being dragged across a concrete floor, punctuated by small, scraping noises, the sound of masonry being chiseled, then a low, guttural grunt. And a voice. It was faint, deep, and heavily distorted by the acoustics of the mill. It wasn't singing or speaking a sentence. It was a single, long, agonizing moan that rose and fell in pitch, like a painful, wounded opera note. Miller quickly isolated the frequency of the moan. "I can try to clean it up, but it's buried deep in the ambient noise." "Don't," Thorne ordered, suddenly realizing. Reyes didn't hear a conversation. He heard this. He heard the pain. As the moan faded, a new sound came into stark relief. It was a muffled, panicked whisper, clearly closer to Wexler's microphone. "Mac? Is that you? What did you do to your face?" "The chalk, it's..." The whisper was violently cut off by a sudden, sickening wet thwack, followed by the sound of something heavy falling. Then, silence. Utter, complete silence. The tape continued to roll for another 5 minutes, capturing only the ambient dust motes of the mill. Until the tape ended, Thorne sat back, the blood drained from his face. "McDougal," he breathed. The whisper mentioned Mac. Wexler didn't just record the killer, he recorded a meeting between the killer and Officer McDougal. And he recorded McDougal's death. "But McDougal's badge was delivered just last night," Cruz countered, her voice shaking. "If McDougal died 12 years ago, why would Reyes be exposed to the sound of his death?" "To silence him before he could talk about the killer," Thorne said grimly. But Wexler's final whispered words, he was talking about Mac's face. "The chalk, it's..." He saw McDougal before McDougal died. And McDougal was already marked. The implication hit them simultaneously. "The killer didn't take McDougal that night," Cruz whispered. "McDougal was working with him. He was the first marked one. He was the one who was supposed to be the sacrifice 12 years ago, but he failed, and Wexler recorded it." Thorne picked up the fourth note again. "The next lesson begins when the music ends." "The music just ended," Thorne said, looking at Miller. "Miller, pull up the personnel files for every single officer who served in the East Division on April 17, 2013, the night McDougal vanished. Look for anyone who worked the Wexler case, had a background in art or music, or had a sudden, unexplained transfer out of the city shortly after." Miller typed furiously. Cruz was looking past Thorne, her eyes wide, staring at the file laid out on the desk, Officer McDougal's original missing person report. "Elias," Cruz said, her voice barely audible. "We've been focusing on the victims and the killer. But what if the next song isn't about finding a body? What if the note wasn't a warning, but an order?" She pointed to the photo of McDougal's empty patrol car from 2013. The photo was high resolution, showing the interior dome light on, illuminating the empty front seat. "McDougal was supposed to be the first sacrifice," Cruz repeated. "He was working with the killer. And the killer is telling us, the next lesson begins when the music ends. Who is the one person right now whose focus is entirely on the end of the music? Who is the one person the killer knows will be hearing this tape?" Thorne slowly turned his head. Miller was gone. The audio technician's chair was empty. The soundproof lab door was slightly ajar, rattling gently in the silence of the room. On Miller's keyboard, where he had been searching the police files, was a hastily typed message, formatted in a single, block quote. "I have already chosen the next player. He is a silent witness, who now knows the song. The chalk is his." Thorne slammed his hand onto the empty keyboard, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Miller, the unassuming audio technician, had been the designated next player. He was the one person who had been sitting in the dark, exposed to the raw sound of the master's drone when the killer's message arrived. Miller just heard McDougal's final moments. "Elias," Cruz hissed, already radioing Central Command. "He knows what McDougal saw. That makes him the silent witness." The precinct went into lockdown, but it was a futile gesture. Miller was an expert in stealth and soundproofing. He could vanish without making a ripple. Security footage showed Miller leaving the A/V lab just seconds after the tape ended, moving with a calm, deliberate speed, clutching a small, black equipment case. Thorne pulled up Miller's personnel file. Carl Miller, 31. Clean record, impeccable technical skills, specialized in sound reconstruction. No immediate family. No known connections to the Peterson Mill or the 2007/2013 cases. He's too clean, Thorne growled, pacing the office. He wasn't chosen randomly. The killer had to know he was the one who would process the tape. This is an inside job, Lena. Someone here is feeding him information, or the killer is someone here. Cruz pointed to the file photo of Miller. He looks like a ghost. He doesn't fit the victim profile. He's not a strong patrolman like Ray is, or a musician like Wexler. He's a listener. And the killer told us, Thorne recalled, slamming his fist down on the fourth note. The chalk is his. The chalk, Cruz echoed. The chalk in Reyes's chest. It's the weapon, but it's also the mark of the sacrifice. Where would Miller go with a black equipment case, knowing he's next? Thorne's eyes focused on the single piece of fresh white chalk found in Wexler's box. It was a new piece for the next performance. He's going to the only place he can hide, where sound doesn't travel, Thorne concluded. He's going back to the mill. Not the tunnels, but the highest point. The old grain silo. It's an acoustic dead zone, completely cut off from the city's sound. They drove back to the mill, sirens silent, hoping to intercept Miller before the killer could reach him. As they approached the massive silo structure connected to the mill, the night was eerily quiet. They found Miller's personal car parked discreetly several blocks away. They entered the silo complex through a narrow maintenance hatch. The air inside was freezing, carrying the sharp, dusty odor of long-dead grain. The only light came from their flashlights, carving tunnels in the absolute darkness. They started their ascent, climbing the skeletal metal staircase that spiraled up the immense, hollow shaft. Every footstep echoed unnervingly, the sound reverberating for seconds before dying out in the huge cylinder of the silo. Halfway up, they found the first sign of Miller. He had stopped on a landing. His black equipment case was open, and he had used a piece of white chalk to draw a thick, crude circle on the metal floor. In the center of the circle, he had drawn the broken tuning fork symbol. He's not running, Cruz whispered, leveling her weapon. He's preparing. He's accepting the mark. This is the conditioning, Thorne said grimly. The tape didn't just scare Reyes, it broke him. It prepared him for the chalk. It's a hypnotic resonance. The killer didn't need to be here to turn Miller. The sound did the work. They continued their climb. The stairs ended at a small, circular observation deck high above the silo floor, looking out over the city through grimy windows. Miller was there. He was standing perfectly still, his back to them, facing the largest, dustiest window. He was holding something small in his hand. Miller. Police. Drop whatever you're holding and turn around slowly. Thorne commanded, his gun steady. Miller didn't move. He simply raised his hand to the window. He was holding a micro-recorder, the kind used for field notes. He turned it on. The small speaker emitted a low, continuous, high-pitched whine, the sound of an ultra-high frequency signal designed to induce physical discomfort and disorientation. Then, through the window, illuminated by the city lights, Thorne saw the final, chilling touch. Miller had used the chalk to draw the broken tuning fork symbol, but he hadn't drawn it on the window. He had drawn it directly onto the glass panel of his own eye. The chalk mark covered his pupil and iris, transforming his eye into a single, terrifying white disk. Elias, Cruz gasped, her voice cracking. He's blinded himself. He's accepted the silence. Miller, stop. The killer isn't here. You can still be saved. Thorne shouted, slowly advancing. Miller finally spoke, his voice dry, quiet, and absolutely devoid of inflection, the voice of a broken instrument. The sacrifice is not meant for the blind, Detective, Miller said, his head perfectly still. the chalked eye staring blankly forward. It is meant for the deaf. The silence must be absolute. He raised his free hand and pressed a small, round object deep into his ear canal. It was an earplug, but not a normal one. It looked like a custom-molded piece of acoustic dampening material. "I have silenced the world," Miller stated. "Now, I can finally hear him." Before Thorne could take another step, a sharp, clear voice sliced through the air, not from Miller, but from a speaker they hadn't seen, placed discreetly on the railing behind them. It was the killer. His voice was calm, clear, and educated, with a slight, almost imperceptible regional accent. "Detective Thorne, you found the player, but you missed the instrument. He is complete. The lesson for you is this: Officer McDougal did not vanish. He simply changed stations." The killer paused, the silence stretching into an eternity. "We have been working together for 12 years, Detective. I have been watching your every move. I have watched you miss the answers I left for you in the very heart of your organization." The speaker clicked, and the voice changed, becoming synthesized and distorted, like the voice on the tape. "I am the one who hears the silence, Elias. And now, I require the sacrifice of those who speak too loud." The small, high-frequency whine from Miller's recorder suddenly increased in volume, morphing into an unbearable, resonant spike of sound that ripped through the small observation deck. Miller dropped the recorder, and then, with a terrible, slow grace, he stepped backward, off the platform and into the 80-foot drop of the empty silo shaft. Thorne lunged, catching only the edge of Miller's jacket, the fabric tearing in his hands. He looked over the edge. Miller was a black shape accelerating into the dust and darkness below. As the body hit the bottom with a muffled thud, the speaker on the railing clicked back on. The killer's calm, clear voice returned. "He sleeps where the water sings, Detective. He sleeps in the echo of McDougal. And you, Elias, are the one who is next scheduled to retire. Your station awaits." Thorne gripped the railing, his breath ragged. He recognized the slight, regional accent now. It was the same one used by one of the city's most respected and longest-serving police figures. A person Thorne worked with every day. The killer was Captain Reynolds. The name hit Thorne with the force of a physical blow. Captain Reynolds. The man who signed his paychecks, who sat across from him in briefing rooms, whose face was the image of stable, institutional authority. The regional accent, slight but distinct, now made sense. It was the polished, controlled cadence of a veteran command officer. "Reynolds," Thorne repeated, his voice barely a rasp. He turned to Cruz, his eyes blazing with shock and certainty. "It's Reynolds." The voice, the accent. He had access to every file, every movement. He knew Miller would be the one processing the sound. Cruz was already on the secure police line, her hand shaking as she spoke into the radio. "Code Red, Captain Reynolds is compromised. Officer Elias Thorne and Detective Lena Cruz are initiating an arrest warrant. Do not engage alone. Repeat, do not engage." Thorne snatched the radio back. "No. Don't call it in. If he's the killer, he has eyes and ears everywhere. We just gave him the tactical advantage. He knows we know. He just murdered Miller, Elias. He used the police radio frequency to taunt us. We have to bring the department down on him. And walk right into his trap? He wants a dramatic ending, Lena. He wants the sacrifice to be poetic. He just told me I'm next. My station awaits. We go in alone, fast, and silent, the way he operates." Thorne's mind raced, piecing together 12 years of missed signals. Reynolds was the one who controlled the budget for the 2013 McDougal search. Reynolds was the one who signed off on the runaway verdict for Daniel Wexler in 2007. He was the conductor of this deadly orchestra. Where would he go? Thorne asked, grabbing Cruz's arm. He finished his piece with Miller. Where does a captain with a god complex, who views murder as art, stage his final act? The precinct, Cruz stated immediately. He told you your station awaits. He's ending it where he started it, in the heart of the East Division. The station is his stage. They drove back to the precinct in a frenzy, slipping in through a seldom-used utility entrance, avoiding the main lobby where Reynolds might have eyes. The building felt oppressively quiet. They moved stealthily through the empty hallways toward the captain's office on the third floor. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. As they reached the heavy oak door of Reynolds's office, they found it unlocked and slightly ajar. Thorne kicked it open and plunged inside. Sig Sauer raised. The office was empty. The lights were off, save for a single, small desk lamp pulling light onto the captain's immaculate desk. But the office wasn't truly empty. IT was redecorated, every single piece of wall space, from the cork board above the desk to the glass front of the bookshelf, was covered with meticulously drawn, hand-chalked symbols. Not the broken tuning fork, but hundreds of unique, tiny acoustic symbols, complex mathematical equations for resonance, and abstract diagrams of sound waves. It looked less like an office and more like a professor's chalkboard gone mad, and on the captain's polished mahogany desk, sitting exactly where his nameplate should have been, was a fifth, new note. Thorne approached cautiously and read the precise script. Your retirement begins where the first instrument was prepared, detective. The silence of the city is not a gift, it is a weapon. The master requires your final sound. Find me where the first blood was spilled. The first blood, Thorne whispered, holstering his weapon and pulling out his radio. Reyes. He's taking him back to the hospital. No, Elias, Cruz corrected, pointing to the chalk markings on the wall. She traced a complex diagram illustrating a sound wave bouncing off a cylindrical object. The first blood wasn't Reyes. It was McDougal. Wexler's tape said, "What did you do to your face?" The chalk. McDougal was the first one marked. The first blood was McDougal's change of station. Cruz pointed to a chalk map on the wall. It was a diagram of the city's old, disused sewer system that ran directly beneath the East Division precinct, a forgotten labyrinth of tunnels right below their feet. The map showed a single, small room marked with the date 2013. Reynolds didn't leave the precinct. He went down, Cruz realized. He's built his final stage in the basement that the city forgot. Thorne quickly found the access point, an old maintenance grate hidden behind a cleaning closet near the armory. It led down a tight, iron ladder into a dark, damp tunnel. We go in together, Lena, Thorne said, pulling on a pair of gloves. He wants to sacrifice the one who speaks too loud. That's me. You cover me. If you see him, don't shoot to wound. Shoot to silence. They descended into the cold, foul air of the sewers. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing ancient brick walls and trickling water. The acoustic environment was dead, the heavy, damp air absorbing all sound, making it hard to hear anything but the slick of their own boots. The tunnel led them to the small, brick-lined room marked on Reynolds's chalk map. The door was heavy iron, bolted from the outside. He locked himself in, Cruz noted, examining the heavy, rusted bolts. He's not running. He's waiting, Thorne corrected. He's waiting for his audience. They managed to pry the bolts open and Thorne shoved the door inward. The sight that greeted them was truly the work of a mad artist. The room was low-ceilinged and circular. Officer McDougal was there. He wasn't a skeleton. He was sitting upright in a high-backed wooden chair, his body perfectly preserved, mummified by the dry, cold air of the isolated room. His patrol uniform was immaculate, but his face was covered entirely by a hard, chalky white mask, a solidified, permanent version of the mark Reyes had suffered. And his hands, withered and pale, were clamped around an ancient, reel-to-reel tape recorder. Next to McDougal, standing calmly in a clean, dry patch of concrete, was Captain Reynolds. He was wearing his full dress uniform, every button shining, his posture military straight. He was holding a small, delicate hammer, the kind used for tuning a piano. "Welcome, Detective Thorne," Reynolds said, his voice calm and completely controlled, devoid of malice, treating the entire scenario as a formal police briefing. "You are late. The final recording is about to begin. The sacrifice must be heard." Reynolds gestured to the wall behind McDougal. It was covered in 12 years of human hair, neatly woven together, creating a grotesque tapestry of twisted strands that amplified the sound coming from McDougal's silent, chalked mouth. "He never vanished," Reynolds explained, touching McDougal's chalked face with the hammer. "He simply volunteered to be the silent instrument. I have been his voice. And now, I will be yours." Thorne raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Captain. Drop the hammer." Reynolds didn't move. He smiled, a cold, polite, terrifying smile. "The greatest power, Elias, is the power of silence," Reynolds said. "I found Wexler's tape 12 years ago. It showed me the truth. The city only pays attention to noise. I decided to give them a sound they couldn't ignore." Reynolds lifted the hammer, aiming for the reel-to-reel recorder in McDougal's hands. "I am the master of the silence. And you, detective, have spoken too loudly." With a swift, final movement, Reynolds brought the hammer down, not on the recorder, but on the delicate, brittle fingers of McDougal's 12-year-dead hand. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber, and the hammer's tiny head snapped off. Flying into the darkness, Reynolds looked at the broken hammer, then at Thorne, his eyes wide with a sudden, genuine surprise, not at the confrontation, but at the failure of his instrument. "I missed," Reynolds said, his voice dropping, the control finally fracturing. The sound, it was imperfect. This small moment of artistic self-criticism was all the opening Thorne needed. "Police! Drop it, Reynolds!" Thorne yelled, firing a single, precise shot aimed at Reynolds' shoulder, avoiding a fatal confrontation. The bullet struck the brick wall just inches from Reynolds, showering the room with pulverized stone. Reynolds flinched, not in fear, but in rage at the interruption of his art. He turned, abandoning his masterpiece, and sprinted deeper into the unmapped tunnels behind McDougal's chair, vanishing into the darkness, leaving Thorne and Cruz alone with the chalk-faced instrument of their own force's history. Thorne and Cruz stood frozen for a split second, the stench of gunpowder mixing with the foul air of the sewer. Reynolds' sudden turn from theatrical calm to manic, furious flight had been jarring. "He's gone!" Cruz shouted, covering the entrance. He had an escape route planned. Thorne ignored her, moving swiftly to the mummified body of Officer McDougal. He gently dislodged the antique reel-to-reel tape recorder from the dead officer's hands. The fragile tape was still intact. He broke his hand to make a final sound, "Lena," Thorne said, examining McDougal's fractured fingers. He was trying to shatter the machine and release a final burst of noise. "He's not just a killer, he's obsessed with the purity of the final score." "The tape, Elias," Cruz urged, pointing at the recorder. "It's been running all this time." McDougal was the first silent witness, the first chalked victim. This must be the ultimate sacrifice tape. They pulled the equipment out of the sewer and sealed the door behind them, knowing Reynolds was now cornered somewhere beneath the precinct, back in the relative safety of the armory. They connected the reel-to-reel recorder to the A/V Lab's secure system. Miller's tragic sacrifice now served a crucial purpose, providing the high-end equipment needed to process the potentially unstable recording. The moment the tape began to play, the room was filled with a familiar, yet chillingly intimate sound, the deep, guttural resonance of McDougal's last moments, recorded 12 years ago. It began with the muffled, panicked whisper of young Daniel Wexler, "Mac? Is that you? What did you do to your face?" The chalk, then came the terrible thwack and silence from Wexler's tape. But the reel-to-reel continued. For a full minute, there was nothing but the sound of labored breathing, the scraping of chalk on McDougal's own face, and then Reynolds's voice, younger, but unmistakably the captain. "You were supposed to be my silent instrument, Mac. You were supposed to stay where the silence sings. But you compromised the sound. Now you must become the anchor." The breathing intensified, and then came a long, agonizing moan, the same wounded opera note that had been heard in Wexler's recording. But then, something new. A series of short, deliberate knocks began to be heard on the recording. Knock. Knock. Pause. Knock. 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 Cruz leaned in, pointing at the monitor. "That's Morse code, Elias." He didn't just record his death, McDougal was communicating. The knocking continued, slow and clear, buried beneath the deep ambient drone of the sewer. The technician, under Thorne's instruction, isolated the sequence. The decoded message was short, cryptic, and devastating. "Reynolds is the son of..." Static. The message was cut off by a sudden, intense burst of static, followed by the sound of concrete being poured. "The son of what?" Thorne demanded, his frustration boiling over. "The son of McDougal? It makes no sense." Cruz grabbed the original McDougal file. "Let's check the files of every officer who died or was killed in the line of duty here before 2007. The year Wexler went missing. If McDougal was saying Reynolds is the son of, it has to be someone in the history of the East Division." Thorne remembered the broken tuning fork symbol, a vertical line with a half circle on top. He realized it wasn't a tuning fork, it was a stylized P. And the line beneath it represented S, PS. "PS," Thorne whispered. "The symbol is PS. A postscript. A signature. Or a name." Cruz's finger landed on a file from 1985, Officer Patrick Stevens. Died in a freak construction accident on the site of the new East Division precinct. The record showed his body was never officially recovered, only his nameplate. The cause of death was officially ruled accidental crushing by a runaway concrete pour. Patrick Stevens, Cruz read aloud. He was 28. He left behind a 2-year-old son. Thorne stared at the file photo of Stevens, a young man with kind eyes. "And what was the name of his son, Lena?" Cruz flipped the page, her eyes widening in horror. His full name was Carl Reynolds Stevens. He changed his last name legally when his mother remarried the year after the accident. He was Captain Carl Reynolds. The connection snapped into place with sickening clarity. Reynolds wasn't just using the precinct, he was avenging the perceived failure of the precinct to recover his father's body. The site of his father's death, the first sacrificial silence, was the precinct itself. Thorne pulled up the precinct blueprints, locating the coordinates of the 1985 accident site, a deep structural column in the main sub-basement. It was directly beneath Reynolds's office. "He's there," Thorne declared. "He went back to the source. He's at his father's grave. And he's got a backup plan." Thorne and Cruz, now armed with shotguns, descended once more into the precinct's lowest level, moving toward the coordinates. The air was thick with the faint scent of ozone and something sharp, like metal being stretched. They found the location, a thick concrete column, unremarkable except for a small, freshly chiseled square of brick near the base. It was the same type of chiseled hole they found at the mill, just large enough for a hand. Thorne knelt and shone his light in. He saw no tunnel, no hidden room, only darkness and a single object resting inside the cavity. It was a small, military-grade detonator, its indicator light blinking steadily red. Next to it was the 7th note, placed carefully on the damp concrete. The silence cannot be broken by a sound you choose. It must be broken by the final frequency. The master's drone will now become the city's song. A clock displayed on the detonator was counting down, 5 minutes and 40 seconds. "He's going to blow the precinct," Cruz gasped, her voice raw. He's going to use the sound to bring down the whole building. Thorne immediately recognized the threat. The East Division precinct was built directly on top of the old sewer system, and the sub-basement tunnels were filled with pockets of methane gas, a deadly, silent, and perfect acoustic amplification system. The blast would collapse the structure, burying the entire department in a final, deafening silence. Thorne grabbed the detonator and began frantically searching for the wires. The wires ran not toward a visible explosive, but deeper into the column itself, toward the presumed resting place of Patrick Stevens. He's not using C4, Lena, Thorne realized, his eyes wide. He's using the gas in the tunnels. But he needs a source of ignition. He needs the final frequency. Suddenly, the familiar, deep thrum-thrum-thrum of the reservoir pipes, the master's drone, began to resonate through the concrete. Reynolds was piping the sound directly into the structure. The sound is the detonation source. Cruz yelled, pointing to the base of the column. He's using the high-frequency vibration to ignite the methane. We have to find him and stop the sound. Thorne looked at the clock, 3 minutes and 15 seconds. He had to find the source of the acoustic frequency, and that meant going deeper into the unmapped silence. We split up, Thorne commanded, grabbing a spool of electrical tape. I'll follow the sound source. You try to cut the detonator wire. If you fail, find an exit. This building is about to sing. Thorne plunged into the darkest, tightest service conduit, following the pulsating thrumming sound, the true heartbeat of Captain Reynolds's horrific, final composition. Thorne crawled through the cramped, iron-ribbed service conduit, the air growing warmer and vibrating violently with the thrum-thrum-thrum of the master's drone. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical, attacking his inner organs, threatening to rupture his eardrums. He glanced at his watch, 2 minutes remaining on the detonator clock. Cruz was running out of time. The conduit opened into a small, dry, subterranean room, a forgotten communications hub, now coated in fine, dry dust. Captain Reynolds was there. He wasn't armed with a gun. He was surrounded by wires, screens, and audio equipment. He looked less like a police captain and more like a conductor preparing for a destructive symphony. At the center of the room was the source of the acoustic frequency, a massive, custom-built acoustic transducer, essentially a giant subwoofer, bolted directly to the main water pipe that ran through the room. The pipe acted as a tuning fork, amplifying the sound and channeling the vibration into the precinct's core. Reynolds looked up at Thorne's sudden entrance, his face serene, almost beatific. "Detective Thorne," Reynolds said, his voice forced and unnaturally loud to overcome the bone-shaking frequency. "You made it. You've come to hear the end of the song." Thorne raised his shotgun, aiming center mass. "It stops now, Captain. Shut it down." Reynolds smiled, a cold, empty expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You misunderstand, Elias. I am not the one who controls the sound. The sound is control. This frequency is keyed precisely to the methane pockets in the sewer network. At 0, the thrum hits the resonant peak, and the entire structure collapses into silence. A monument to the ones we failed to hear." Thorne edged closer, trying to navigate the web of wires. "You failed your father, Carl. You're turning him into a weapon. This isn't justice, it's a terrorist attack." "Justice?" Reynolds scoffed, his eyes hardening. "My father was sacrificed to the city's silence in 1985, buried alive by a concrete pour that this precinct authorized. They called it accidental. They covered up the failure. They silenced him. McDougal heard the same silence, the institution's willingness to bury the truth, and he joined me. He was the first to accept the mark of chalk, the mark of silence." Reynolds pointed to a large, insulated box near his feet. "Inside this box is McDougal's badge, Wexler's final recording, Miller's chalked eye, and a complete record of our 12-year partnership. It's a time capsule." When the precinct falls, it becomes the ultimate artistic statement, the city's roar silenced by the master's drone. The timer on Thorne's watch flashed 1 minute and 10 seconds. The air was vibrating so intensely that dust rained down from the ceiling. "You can't win, Carl," Thorne yelled. "If you kill the entire precinct, you achieve nothing." "I achieve purity," Reynolds countered, walking toward the transducer. He placed his hand on the vibrating metal pipe. "To silence the entire building is to finally quiet the guilt of this institution. You want to stop it, Elias? You have to disconnect the source." The transducer was wired into a massive industrial battery backup, designed to keep the frequency pumping even if the power grid failed. The only way to stop the sound was to smash the unit or cut the thick, multi-core cable running into it. "I have to take the shot, Lena," Thorne muttered into his comm link, knowing the signal was likely breaking up. Reynolds, sensing the moment of decision, knelt by the transducer. He picked up a microphone, a professional recording mic, and clipped it to his uniform lapel. "You are my final witness, detective. The last thing I say will be recorded and preserved in the silence. The final message for the master's score." He looked directly at Thorne, his eyes burning with fanaticism. "I am the son of the silent, and I choose to be the final note." 00:00:30. Reynolds suddenly slammed his hand down on a large, red button mounted on the side of the transducer. The thrumming sound instantly changed, the frequency spiking dangerously high, the vibration turning into a searing, knife-like whine. Thorne fired his shotgun, aiming at the transducer's connection box. The blast tore through the metal housing, sending sparks and smoke everywhere, but the powerful sound did not stop. "It's a shielded system, detective," Reynolds screamed, the whine of the transducer overpowering his voice. "The sound is running on the backup. You only have seconds left. What is your final sound, Elias?" Thorne's ears were bleeding. He could feel the pressure building in his head, a searing pain that threatened to blind him. He couldn't risk another shot that might ignite the methane. 00:00:15. He saw Reynolds close his eyes, a look of profound ecstasy on his face as the high-pitched whine reached its crescendo, poised to hit the final, fatal resonant frequency. Thorne lunged, dropping the shotgun, and tackled Reynolds against the vibrating pipe. He wasn't aiming to kill, he was aiming to disrupt the sound. The impact sent a shockwave of vibration through Thorne's body. He grabbed Reynolds' head and slammed it against the humming pipe, not once, but twice. Reynolds' eyes snapped open, his ecstatic expression replaced by surprise and pain. He collapsed, unconscious, against the wall. Thorne looked at the transducer. The red light was still blinking, the sound still pulsing, but it had dipped slightly in intensity. The final frequency was still coming. 00:00:05. He grabbed the thick, multi-core cable running from the backup battery. It was too thick to cut. There was only one way. With a roar of pure adrenaline and desperation, Thorne braced his feet against the wall and ripped the cable out of the transducer's housing with his bare hands. The sound vanished. The oppressive vibration stopped instantly, replaced by a sudden, profound, and absolute silence. 00:00:00. Thorne collapsed onto the floor, panting, the silence a crushing weight after the acoustic assault. He heard a faint, distant whisper in his earpiece. "Elias, I disarmed the primary." "What happened?" "It was Cruz." "It's over, Lena," Thorne croaked, his voice thick with blood and dust. "The master is silenced. Get down here. And bring medical." Thorne looked at the unconscious Captain Reynolds, the master of silence. The microphone was still clipped to his dress uniform, and the recorder in his pocket was still running, capturing only the final sound of the ripping cable and the subsequent silence. But the horror was not yet over. Thorne's flashlight beam caught something glinting near Reynolds' hand, an eighth, tiny note, which must have fallen from his pocket during the struggle. Thorne picked it up. It was written in the same perfect script, But this one was different. It was written in pencil, not ink, and it was addressed not to Thorn, but to someone else. If the master fails, the keeper will inherit the score. The chalk is in the keeper's hand. Continue the lesson in the House of the Lost. The silence in the subterranean room was profound, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of Thorn and the unconscious form of Captain Reynolds. Thorn stared at the final note, the pencil script a chilling departure from the master's usual ink. If the master fails, the keeper will inherit the score. The chalk is in the keeper's hand. Continue the lesson in the House of the Lost. Thorn knelt beside Reynolds, securing his hands with his own handcuffs, a symbolic, necessary act. The keeper, he muttered, running the words through his mind. It's a contingency plan. Another person inside, ready to step in if Reynolds was silenced. Crude stumbled into the room, flashlight beam frantic. She saw Reynolds, the ripped cable, and the ominous note. Is he disarmed? Did the building collapse? He's neutralized, Thorn confirmed, his voice rough. But he left us a successor. The keeper. Someone who inherits the score, his artistic motive. And the House of the Lost. Cruz, thinking analytically despite the trauma, checked Reynolds's internal police radio. It was off, but the mic on his uniform was still hot. The last thing he recorded was the silence, Elias. But he was communicating with someone. Thorn picked up the small box that held the victim's trophies. He said the box was a time capsule. He was documenting his art for someone to appreciate. The keeper isn't just an accomplice of Lena, they're an apprentice. They called in the situation, issuing a department-wide alert for the arrest of Captain Reynolds and a manhunt for the unknown accomplice. The precinct was immediately evaluated and placed under structural lockdown, back in a temporary command center established at a nearby fire station. Thorn and Cruz revisited the files, searching for anyone connected to both Reynolds and the keeper designation. The House of the Lost is what we need to decode, Cruz stated, projecting the latest aerial maps of the city. The mill, the reservoir, the precinct, they were all tied to old city infrastructure and forgotten history. What place in this city is known as the House of the Lost? Thorn's eye fell on a faded archival map. The orphanage. The old St. Jude's orphanage. It was shut down 20 years ago and is slated for demolition. Half of the city's unidentifiable missing persons files are tied to that building when it was running. They called it the city's place of forgotten childhoods, the House of the Lost. The orphanage was the perfect acoustic location, a massive, derelict structure known for its vast, empty chapel and echoing halls, a place where sound would carry and magnify. Now, the keeper, Thorn said, returning to Reynolds's professional life. Reynolds didn't trust anyone but McDougal to start the score. Who did he trust to keep the score going? They pulled up the list of Reynolds's direct administrative staff, the ones with access to his private office and schedules, the ones who kept his life running smoothly. There was only one name that leaped out, Evelyn Shaw, Reynolds's longtime executive assistant. A woman in her late 40s, known for her severe demeanor, her quiet efficiency, and her obsessive loyalty to the captain. Shaw was with him for 15 years, Cruz observed. She managed his entire life. She was his eyes and ears in the precinct, the quietest person in the room. The keeper of his routine, Thorn finished. The chalk is in her hand. The symbol is the chalk mark. She is the one who will perform the next sacrifice. They rushed to Shaw's last known address, a small, nondescript apartment complex near the city limits. The apartment was empty, cleared out within the last 24 hours. But Shaw, like Reynolds, left a deliberate piece of evidence on the kitchen counter. Next to a jar of India ink and a fresh box of white chalk was a framed photo. It was a picture of a young Carl Reynolds, smiling proudly in his police academy uniform. Standing beside him, just out of focus, was Evelyn Shaw. But the most chilling detail was a small, almost invisible chalk drawing on the glass covering the photo, the broken tuning fork symbol, the PS mark. She was the keeper. She knew the secret of Patrick Stevens. Thorne pulled out his phone. "We're going to St. Jude's orphanage. Evelyn Shaw is setting up the next sacrifice." As they drove across the deserted city toward the imposing, dark silhouette of the orphanage, a call came through on the secure police band, not from the precinct, but from the hospital where Officer Reyes was recovering. The dispatcher's voice was high and panicked. "Unit 10 to 97. Officer Reyes's room is breached." A female subject, identified as Evelyn Shaw, was seen entering the room. "Security is unresponsive." "No!" Thorne yelled, slamming the steering wheel. "She's going back for the first instrument. She's completing the score." Reyes, the silent witness, the first mark, was her final, necessary sacrifice. Shaw wasn't going to kill him quietly. She was going to use the acoustic environment of the orphanage to make his final, agonizing sound a broadcast to the entire city. Thorne spun the car around, accelerating toward the hospital, knowing that Shaw, the quiet, efficient keeper, was now rushing Reyes toward the house of the lost. She was finishing the lesson, and the final, horrific echo was about to begin. The dash lights blurred as Thorne drove the cruiser like a missile toward the Metropolitan General Hospital. The dispatcher's frantic updates confirmed the worst. Evelyn Shaw, the silent, efficient keeper, had executed a flawless snatch and grab. She had disabled the floor's security cameras minutes before entering Reyes's room, neutralizing the single armed guard with a precise, quick chemical agent, a level of professional stealth that spoke volumes of her long, unexamined loyalty to Reynolds. "She didn't use force," Elias Cruz reported, analyzing the limited security footage that remained. "She used silence. She knew the hospital routine as well as she knew Reynolds' schedule." They arrived at the hospital, storming Reyes's floor. The scene was chaos, medical staff huddled, security officers bewildered. Reyes's bed was empty. On the pillow, neatly folded, was the 8th note, the pencil-scripted instruction from Reynolds that Shaw had dropped in the sewer. Shaw had left it as a chilling receipt. A terrified nurse finally offered a key piece of information. She was dressed as a custodian. She wheeled him out in a laundry cart. And she was talking to him, sir. She kept telling him, "Don't fight the silence. The music is waiting." "She's taking him to the orphanage," Thorne confirmed, his voice tight with controlled fury. "The House of the Lost. It's the perfect acoustic chamber for her final sacrifice. Reyes is the instrument she needs to complete Reynolds' score." The orphanage, St. Jude's, was 15 minutes across town, a crumbling, Gothic structure on a hill overlooking the harbor. As Thorne drove, he radioed Central Command, detailing the location, the suspect, Evelyn Shaw, and the victim, Officer Reyes. "No sirens, no lights within a 2-block radius," Thorne ordered, overriding the standard procedure. "She's monitoring the frequency. If she hears us coming, she'll execute Reyes immediately. We go in silent." They parked the cruiser half a mile away and proceeded on foot, moving through the overgrown, iron gates of St. Jude's. The building was vast, shrouded in twilight, its empty windows like cold, dark eyes watching their approach. The air here was different, cold, still, and unnervingly resonant. Every crunch of gravel under their boots seemed to echo, only to be swallowed by the building's deep, cavernous silence. They entered the main hall. It was a ruin of chipped paint, broken glass, and dust. The dust, however, was disturbed. A single, fresh set of wheelchair tracks led across the hall toward the main chapel doors, the acoustic heart of the orphanage. "The chapel," Cruz whispered, leveling her sig-high ceilings, "perfect resonance. She's going to use the architecture itself to amplify Reyes's final sound." Thorne pushed the double doors open, and the sight inside stopped his heart. The chapel was enormous, 2 stories high, with a vaulted ceiling and long, lead-paned windows. It was nearly pitch black, but a single, Focused spotlight shone down from the balcony onto the center of the altar stage. Officer Samuel Reyes was strapped into a wheelchair on the stage, his body motionless. He was completely obscured by a complex arrangement of thin, taut wires strung from the floor to the ceiling, a physical cage that looked like a musical staff, and at the center of the wires, Evelyn Shaw stood, illuminated by the cold, white light. She wore her usual severe, dark suit, but she had replaced her glasses with a pair of welding goggles, pushed up onto her forehead. In her hand, she held a large, professional piece of white blackboard chalk, its tip sharp and ready. She wasn't looking at Reyes. She was looking at the microphone stands positioned around the stage, each mic wired to a massive, custom-built speaker stack placed in the chapel's choir loft. "Welcome, Detective Thorne," Shaw said, her voice quiet, but amplified and crisp through the microphones, resonating perfectly in the chamber. "The keeper is ready. The master gave the score. I conduct the finale. It ends now, Shaw," Thorne yelled, stepping into the light, his shotgun raised. "You let him go." Reynolds is silenced. "The score is dead." Shaw chuckled, a dry, emotionless sound that echoed like shattering glass. "The master is only temporarily indisposed. He knew the risks of his artistry. But the score is eternal, Detective. It is the sound that proves the silence exists." She pointed the chalk at the wire cage surrounding Reyes. "This is a resonating chamber, Detective. The wires are tuned to specific frequencies. Reyes is stable, but delicate. If you move too fast, or fire your weapon, the sound will shatter these wires, and the vibration will cause his heart to fail instantly." Thorne saw the tiny, terrifying detail. The chalk wasn't just in her hand. She had used a piece to trace a tiny, identical broken tuning fork symbol, the PS mark, onto the center of Reyes's chalked sternum wound, directly over the chalk hole. "What do you want, Evelyn?" Thorne lowered his weapon slightly, knowing she had seized absolute control. "I want the purity of the sound," Shaw answered, her eyes focused on the choir loft. Daniel Wexler found the water's song. Reyes found the silence. Now, Reyes will sing the final truth. The truth that the institution always buries. She walked to Reyes's wheelchair, placing the tip of the chalk against the edge of the hole in his chest. "The chalk must be placed completely, Detective. The final mark of silence. But first, the final sound." Shaw reached to the side of Reyes's wheelchair and flipped a small, hidden switch. A new sound filled the chapel, the sound of an ultrasensitive micro-recorder. It wasn't the master's drone. It was a faint, agonizing, high-pitched whimpering, the sound of Officer Reyes's internal panic, his inability to speak, his sheer terror. Shaw was amplifying his pain. "I will record and amplify his agony," Shaw stated, her voice chillingly professional. "And then, I will complete the ritual. You have 1 minute, Detective, before I give the city the final, perfect sound of institutional betrayal. Your final sound is your only chance to stop the inevitable." She pulled a small, delicate tuning fork from her pocket. She struck it against the altar, and the high, clear ping of the fork resonated in the chapel, cutting through Reyes's whimpers. Thorne knew this was the resonant frequency she needed to amplify Reyes's sound to a catastrophic level. "I will take your silence, Evelyn," Thorne said, dropping his shotgun. He held up his hands, completely exposed. "I know your goal. You want to honor Patrick Stevens. You want the city to hear the betrayal. I will give you the full story of Patrick Stevens. I will tell the city the truth that Reynolds failed to achieve. But you have to let Reyes go. Let me be the final witness." Shaw paused, her chalk hovering over Reyes's chest. She was intrigued by the offer of a new, final witness. She wanted the perfect ending, the perfect recording. "Speak, Detective," Shaw commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, amplified 1,000 times by the chapel acoustics. "The microphone is waiting." Your time to sing is now. Thorne slowly walked forward, right into the cone of the spotlight, placing himself directly between Shaw and the stage exit. His voice, rough and strained, was the only thing standing between Reyes and the final, fatal mark. He began to speak, knowing that every single word was being recorded and amplified through the choir loft speakers. He was giving the keeper the final, desperate testimony she craved. Thorne stood in the center of the chapel, bathed in the white glare of the spotlight. The sound of Reyes's terrified whimpering was amplified, a constant, sickening background track to the scene. The high, clear ping of Shaw's tuning fork still faintly resonated in the vast space. Thorne knew his words had to be perfect, a confession that would satisfy Shaw's artistic obsession with institutional betrayal, yet buy enough time for a desperate, final move. You want the truth, Evelyn? The truth that Reynolds couldn't give you because he was just a self-pitying artist obsessed with his own mythology? Thorne's voice, though rough, was strong and clear, picked up by the surrounding microphones. I'll give you the truth of Patrick Stevens, the whole, ugly silence. Shaw tilted her head, the chalk poised. Go on, detective. Let the city hear the betrayal. Patrick Stevens didn't die by accident, Evelyn, Thorne stated, watching for any flicker of reaction in her eyes. He was murdered. And Captain Reynolds, Carl, he didn't know the whole truth. He let that sink in, watching the slightest widening of Shaw's eyes. In 1985, Officer Stevens was investigating a massive embezzlement ring involving the precinct construction funds. He found the evidence, and he was ready to blow the whistle. But the people he was investigating found him first. Thorne took a deep, calculated breath. They pushed him into that cement pour. They made it look like an accident. Reynolds has been avenging the silence of the institution, but he missed the real killers. It wasn't the institution that silenced his father, Evelyn. It was two individuals. And I know who they are. Shaw's composure fractured. The chalk wavered, her breath catching in the microphone's pickup. This was the twist she hadn't anticipated, a deeper betrayal. You lie, Thorne, she hissed, her voice shaking. Carl spent 12 years proving the system was complicit. Don't cheapen his score. I don't cheapen it, I perfect it, Thorne countered, pressing his advantage. The two men who killed Patrick Stevens walked free. One retired 5 years ago. The other, he was close to Stevens. He was the one who authorized the final concrete pour that day, the one who buried the evidence. Thorne locked eyes with Shaw. His name was Deputy Chief Walter Hayes. He's alive, he's safe, and he walks free because Carl Reynolds was too obsessed with an artistic statement to look for the real, human betrayal. He was too busy creating the silence to hear the whisper of the truth. The mention of Hayes, a prominent, recently retired deputy chief, struck Shaw with visible force. It was a name that carried weight, a hidden architect of the precinct's deep, dark history. If you know this, why the silence, Thorne? Shaw demanded, her chalk hand dropping slightly. Because the man who authorized the cover-up, the man who let Hayes retire quietly, was the captain who was in charge in 1985, a man named Edward Varick, Thorne revealed. Varick shielded Hayes, and Varick promoted Carl Reynolds when he joined the force. Reynolds was protected by the very silence he was trying to expose. The entire story, the perfect, self-contained tragedy of betrayal and generational failure within the police force, was exactly the narrative complexity Shaw needed to complete the score. Shaw looked away from Thorne and up at the choir loft, toward the massive speaker stack. She was computing the new data, weighing the artistic merit of the new truth against her loyalty to Reynolds' original, flawed score. This was the moment. 10 seconds of Reyes's whimpering had stretched into nearly 2 minutes, but Thorne couldn't wait any longer. A.S. Shaw's attention was fully absorbed in the terrible new information. Thorne moved. He wasn't aiming for Shaw. He was aiming for the microphone stand closest to him. With a sudden, explosive burst of movement, Thorne didn't grab the stand. He slapped his own hand against the microphone grill with full force, creating a sudden, violent, deafening screech of feedback, the feedback, amplified by the chapel's acoustics and the speaker stack, was a catastrophic sound, a pure, unfiltered blast of noise that overwhelmed the sensitive wires and the small recorder amplifying Reyes's whimpers. The sound system in the choir loft instantly overloaded. Boom! The speaker stack exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. The wires surrounding Reyes instantly went slack, the finely tuned tension broken by the sonic assault. Shaw recoiled, clutching her ears, the shock of the sound instantly neutralizing her control. The chalk fell from her hand, skittering across the stage. Lena! Now! Thorne roared. Cruz, who had been creeping through the shadows of the nave, burst into the spotlight, tackling Shaw with a low, efficient hit. The keeper was neutralized, pinned to the floor, her welding goggles snapping off her forehead. Thorne rushed to Reyes's wheelchair. The officer was barely conscious, but alive, his shallow breaths visible in the spotlight. The keeper was silenced. The master was imprisoned. But the horror had yet one last, final reverberation. As Cruz struggled to secure the fiercely resistant Shaw, the woman's eyes, the pale, cold eyes of the ultimate loyalist, found Thorne's. "You spoke the truth, Detective," Shaw rasped, a terrible, triumphant smile stretching her lips. "The master failed to silence you, but you gave the true score. Now, the final silence begins." Thorne looked around the room, feeling a profound sense of wrongness. The room was silent. The threat was neutralized, but Shaw wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the single, massive, two-story stained glass window at the back of the altar, which depicted the biblical scene of St. Jude helping the lost. Thorne turned, lifting his flashlight beam. Across the bottom pane of the stained glass, using the last piece of chalk Shaw had dropped, was a single, fresh, thick white line, a line that had not been there seconds ago, and standing silently, outside the window, observing the entire final scene from the shadows of the overgrown orphanage grounds, was a third figure. They were tall, wearing dark clothing that obscured their features, and they were holding something in their hand, something that caught the light. The object was a small, delicate tuning fork. And as Thorne watched, the figure slowly raised the fork, struck it against the stone sill, and disappeared into the night, leaving the faint, high, crystalline ping echoing in the chapel. The master had an apprentice. The keeper had a successor. The silent score was destined to continue. The subsequent hours were a blur of sterile procedure and profound exhaustion. Cruz secured Evelyn Shaw, who remained eerily silent, her face fixed in the same unsettling, triumphant smile. Officer Reyes was rushed back to intensive care, alive, though deeply traumatized. Captain Reynolds was officially charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and domestic terrorism. Thorne and Cruz sat in the temporary command center, now fully operational with forensics teams processing the scene at the orphanage, the precinct basement, and the Peterson Mill. The story Thorne told, the truth about Patrick Stevens, Hayes, and Varick, was already leaking, threatening to tear the East Division apart. Shaw gave us the master, but she revealed the existence of a third party, Cruz said, her voice hoarse, pointing to the spot where the figure had stood outside the orphanage window. That chalk line and the final tuning fork ping, that wasn't Shaw. That was the successor. The chalk line on the stained glass was analyzed. It wasn't the broken tuning fork symbol, PS. It was a simple, yet chilling, line drawn horizontally across the bottom of the glass pane, beneath the image of St. Jude. Underneath it, written in the same new pencil script as the final note, was a single, cryptic word, chorus. The chorus, Thorne mused, running a hand over his weary face. Wexler's composition was the city's quiet chorus. The successor is not just continuing the score, they're turning the entire city into their instrument. Forensics delivered a crucial finding from the Peterson Mill, a high-resolution analysis of the tiny spiral incision found on Officer Reyes's broken radio unit. The incision was not made by a knife. It was a burn mark, created by a device utilizing precise, focused sonic vibration, a specialized tool used by professional sound engineers for acoustic manipulation. The successor is a sound engineer, Cruise realized. They aren't driven by vengeance like Reynolds, or loyalty like Shaw. They're driven purely by the art of acoustic terror. They cross-referenced all personnel files and known associates of Reynolds and Shaw, focusing on anyone with a background in advanced audio technology, acoustics, or musicology. One name surfaced from the archive of Daniel Wexler's university records. Wexler's former advisor and professor, Dr. Julian Marsh, a renowned acoustic engineer and minimalist composer, was known for his eccentric theories on acoustic ecology, the idea that every structure, every city, sings its own song. He had been a vocal proponent of Wexler's work before Wexler's disappearance and was reportedly devastated by the incident. He was also a consultant for the city on noise abatement, giving him unique, legitimate access to all of the city's resonant locations, the mill, the reservoir, and the tunnels beneath the precinct. Marsh wasn't just Wexler's professor, Thorne said, looking at Marsh's recent activity logs. He was the technical expert who signed off on the unstable rating for the Peterson Mill, making it the perfect initial stage for Reynolds's plan. They drove to Dr. Julian Marsh's residence, a secluded house nestled deep in the University District, a place that, ironically, prioritized silence. The house was dark. They approached cautiously, finding the front door unlocked. Inside, the house was silent and empty. The walls were covered not in chalk, but in complex, elegant diagrams written in graphite and charcoal, schematics for sound waves, frequency modulators, and massive, city-scale acoustic amplification systems. On a large desk, set up meticulously, was a ninth and final note, clearly left for them. It was written in the beautiful, precise handwriting, but this time, signed with a complex, mathematical symbol for wave resonance. The master's score was flawed by motive, the keeper's finale was flawed by emotion.